Welcome back to the top 20 most disappointing games of 2016 countdown. If you haven't seen the other parts yet, be sure to check the video description where I'll put a link because you want to watch these in order so that it makes sense. And you also don't want to miss out on some of the crappiest games of the past year. Without further ado, let's continue with our countdown. Number 4, Final Fantasy 15. Yes, yet again, another game on this countdown that got stuck in development hell for the greater part of 10 years this time. Final Fantasy 15 was originally supposed to be part of a Final Fantasy 13 trilogy of games until the game was delayed so many times that idea was completely scrapped and this game was started and rebooted from the ground up just a few years ago. Final Fantasy 15 in its own right is a good game, and because it's on this countdown, I don't want people to think that it's terrible. But boy, did it have a long list of shortcomings, including a combat system that was a far departure from anything in the Final Fantasy franchise previously, being far more action-based than anything else, and basically leaving a lot of gamers who love this long-running series kind of in the dust, saying, what happened to the gameplay that I used to know and love? A camera that during combat half the time doesn't work, in particular in indoor areas, leading to cheap deaths and easily being overwhelmed by enemies. But ultimately, the worst part of this game is that as you play through the story, you realize it's unfinished. Much like Metal Gear Solid 5 in 2015, Final Fantasy 15's story just rushes along, pulls you out of a fun open world experience, throws you into an incredibly linear one that makes absolutely no sense. There's characters who just appear out of thin air and act like you've known them for a long time. Characters disappear and reappear with absolutely no explanation. Villains that were never explained become big boss baddies and then are never heard from again. The story is incredibly disjointed and confusing. It's obvious to tell that a ton of content was cut out of this game, or just simply put, never finished, and this game was rushed to market. Despite having a 10-year development cycle, the game still feels incredibly unfinished, and that is unacceptable for a game in 2016. So although the game is kind of an entertaining experience, it has so many shortcomings that I feel that for a lot of people, it still ends up being one of the most disappointing games of 2016, and I even went so far to say that I felt this game could have been one of, if not the best JRPG ever made if it actually was finished, but because of the amount of bugs, issues, combat mechanics that don't work, and an unfinished story, sadly, it doesn't reach its greatness potential, and that's very disappointing. Number 3, Homefront: The Revolution. Well, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised to hear this game on my most disappointing games countdown, considering that at the time that I reviewed it, I called it the worst game that I had ever played. Homefront: The Revolution is a pathetic mess. Upon launch, the frame rate of this game was so low on consoles that it was impossible to even properly aim and hit enemies, which is pretty bad when the main gameplay component of a first-person shooter is actually shooting things. In addition, it just reeked of being incredibly lazy. The gameplay combat was terrible. The guns were laughable, shooting off fireworks and just silly things. They looked and acted more like toys than anything else. How about the fact that the NPCs in the game are literally identical, and the game developers couldn't put in enough time or effort to even separate the clones from standing next to each other. This game sucks. This is everything bad with modern gaming. Let's have an idea for a game, but instead of actually having the time and effort to put together one that's worth someone's hard-earned dollar, let's just try to rush some generic crap out there, a bunch of repetitive fetch quests, a bunch of repetitive generic side missions to say that the length of the game is longer than it actually is. Let's not actually make the game play at a playable frame rate. Let's just sell, and then fix later. And the bottom line is that Homefront: The Revolution apparently was fixed some month later after release with several different patches and updates that made the game a much more enjoyable experience. But for people who bought it at launch, this game was a stinky piece of crap. It's unacceptable to be selling games that are not functional upon launch, and in this day and age, we're just not going to put up with this kind of crap anymore. Homefront: The Revolution, you suck. Number 2, No Man's Sky. And you know what? I can't even get through the title of this game without starting to laugh, because this by far was the biggest example of false advertisement in 2016 that I've seen in quite some time. No Man's Sky was advertised for 2 straight years as a game that was going to break ground and do something revolutionary. There were going to be randomly generated, progressively generated planets on which there'd be fauna and flora and a variety variety of creatures, and you were going to be able to fly custom-made spacecraft throughout this open-world galaxy with an almost infinitesimal number of these generated planets. The game would have endless amounts of content, and if this game really took off, it could change the way that games were made forever. Yeah, and then when the game was released for a full retail price in the summer of 2016, we all saw what it really was. A bunch of boring, barren, open-world planets that had absolutely nothing interesting on them. Oh, mine some minerals so that you can maybe upgrade your spacecraft and use warp to travel to the next barren and boring planet. Now, to be fair, yes, there actually were some planets that had some interesting things on them, but the problem was there was so much wasted downtime between interesting things in this game that most people hated it. You cannot have a game and promise the world and only show the interesting stuff during your 2 years of marketing for it, only to find out that that stuff is incredibly rare and some people who bought the game would never even encounter it. You couldn't make your own bases, you couldn't do a ton of stuff that you would think you would be able to do in a game like this, and it became incredibly underwhelming and basically the poster boy for false advertisement over the course of 2016. Now, to be fair, No Man's Sky did actually release a ton of free updates later on in the year that added things like base building and some of the core things that people had expected in the original base game. But the sad fact is that so many people were so turned off by this game, no one ever really went back to it, and most people actually demanded refunds from Steam and other places, making it probably one of the most derided games of the year. And it's really sad when you have a game that seems that it could have so much potential, but because it's in the hands of a dev team that either overpromises and underdelivers, or was just so inept with what they were doing that they could not live up to expectations, that No Man's Sky ended up being more of a joke than a milestone in gaming history. Number one, and I say this with a sigh of disappointment and a heavy heart, the most disappointing game of 2016 was Street Fighter V. Now, I don't know how many of you here know this, but I am a lifelong fan of Street Fighter. My extensive coverage of Street Fighter 4 on YouTube was what got me my initial popularity here and allowed me to do this as a job back in 2010 and 2011. I was a former professional Street Fighter player. I've actually won major tournaments like EVO before. And so, to play Street Fighter V and see what they did with this franchise this year crushed me. This is a game that I so much wanted to be successful on multiple levels, and sadly it failed on two entirely different levels at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about that. First off, at launch, Street Fighter V was released as one of, if not the most bare bones console video game ever created. This game only had online versus, offline versus, and a very basic kind of story mode, and that was it. It didn't have any kind of formal challenges. It didn't have any kind of an in-depth level tutorial or anything for the characters, which is exactly what you would want from a brand new game in the franchise. Hell, it didn't even have online lobbies for multiplayer. This game was released incredibly bare bones. And boy, was there a backlash when in February of 2016, people who had bought Street Fighter 4 and had all of that stuff at launch paid the same amount of retail dollars for this one, only to find out all of that content was sorely lacking. Not everyone buys fighting games for the competitive side, and anyone who wanted to play Street Fighter 5 and not play it at a competitive tournament level found themselves incredibly underwhelmed during the first few months of its release. Now, in addition, the netcode of Street Fighter V at first was non-functional. The game not only didn't have much single-player content, but then when you actually went to play it online for the first couple of weeks, it was impossible to get matches. The connections were absolutely terrible. You would disconnect. It was an absolute laughingstock, and there were even rumors across the internet that Capcom had only hired one person to actually work on the netcode of the game, which is unfathomable for a game that's supposed to be a AAA game release. Now, in Capcom's defense, as the year passed by, they actually did add in a lot of additional content to the game that was missing, including a full-on story mode, challenges for each characters, and the like. And yes, they did actually get the netcode under control, and as of right now, the netcode in online play of Street Fighter V isn't so bad, so that's a good thing. But the problem was that as time went on, the competitive aspect of Street Fighter V started to be brought into question, because people started to realize it seemed like in this game, you just simply couldn't react to things as fast as you could in previous Street Fighter games. For example, if someone's jumping at you, why is it harder in Street Fighter V to hit them with an anti-air move than in any Street Fighter previously before this one? So people sat down and studied the game and found out that Street Fighter V actually has 8 frames of input delay. That's more than any other competitive fighting game ever before in the Street Fighter franchise. To give you some perspective, what that means is when you push a button, it takes longer in Street Fighter V for that input to actually take effect in the game than any other Street Fighter beforehand. So if you see someone jumping at you, you push the button to hit them, it might not come out in time to knock them out of the air, and that's ridiculous. Street Fighter and any competitive game is based upon both a game plan but also reactions to that game plan. You need to be able to try to counter and counterattack and do things in response to an opponent's attempted attack on you. And if there's more delay in this game than any other game, it basically means it's the worst competitive fighting game ever in modern memory. It's a joke. Now, some people kind of defended this and said, oh, but maybe Capcom intended it. But then later on in the year, Capcom released the input of frame delay to only 6.5 frames. So obviously, if they're reducing it, it means that it wasn't intended to begin with, and people don't want it. It's hilarious because so many people defended this game over the course of the year, and after I played it with all the different DLC characters and such, ultimately, even though I was a longtime Street Fighter fan, and someone, like I said, who's been in tournaments and played every major competitive Street Fighter game, I just stopped playing it. I can't stomach it. I know it's the worst made Street Fighter ever. It's an absolute laughingstock that we can try to justify a game that has this much input delay. And I simply put, am not going to play it anymore. I wish more people would listen to me and understand that when you support a practice like this, a game that was inferiorly designed, and you keep putting money into it, and you keep buying DLC characters, and you keep buying outfits, and you keep going to tournaments, and you keep watching live streams of it, and you support this kind of a half-finished, half-assed piece of crap fighting game, Capcom will never learn. As consumers and as gamers, whether or not you love Street Fighter or hate it, when you know that a game is worse than anything else ever made, you need to stand up collectively and say, we will not support this practice moving forward. The sad fact is, the competitive fighting game community is desperate because they're afraid that if Street Fighter V dies out because it is an inferior game, what's going to happen to their community that got built up from this hardcore fan base originating from the resurgence of interest in fighting games back with the release of Street Fighter IV. They're so terrified that their little piece of subculture is going to disappear if Street Fighter V fails, that they'd be more willing to hide the problems with the game and continuously support it and throw more money at Capcom constantly than say, no, we're going to boycott it because we know it's a piece of shit. That is sad and pathetic. And the bottom line is, what is to stop Capcom from releasing Street Fighter VI with even more frames of input delay because they realized that people just bought the fucking game anyway and ignored it with Street Fighter V. It really is a sad state. At least for me, I'm the kind of person, I'm more diversified. I'm not so reliant on fighting games and fighting game coverage that I'm forced to play and continuously support a game that I know is subpar like Street Fighter V. Sadly, not everyone is in the same boat as me, but all I can say is this. Street Fighter V by far was the most disappointing game not only of 2016, but of recent memory for me. Not ever have I had such a beloved franchise that used to be the top of the mountain, the king of the crop. Street Fighter was the quintessential top dog of competitive fighting games, and because of an inept game development team that listened to all the wrong people, made all the wrong choices, and ended up releasing a subpar, input delayed, bare bones game, this franchise has effectively been run into the ground outside of the hardcore fans. That's a shame. Hopefully, at some point in the future, they'll figure out how they screwed up and turn it around. But for now, Street Fighter V is a huge, stinking dud. And that is it for my top 20 most disappointing games of 2016 countdown. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please spread the word about KO Gaming. Please consider giving this video a like here on YouTube, and please consider subscribing because there's going to be a few more series like this coming in the near future, as well as some highly detailed game reviews and the like. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and as always, I hope to see you next time right here on KO Gaming. Peace out.